Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Errors Are Lurking in Your Trial Data, presented by Medidata. I'm Jennifer Levin, contributor to Fierce Pharma and Fierce Biotech, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Stacy Yunt, Principal Strategic Consulting, Medidata Solutions, Kyle Given, VP Professional Services, Medidata Solutions, and Ruthie Davey, Director, Data Science, Medidata Solutions. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Files button at the lower left of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions during or after the presentations by clicking on the Q&A button in the lower left corner of the screen. And now over to Kalyani, who is going to introduce our speakers today. Kalyani, all yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kalyani, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Medidata is reinventing global drug development by creating the industry's leading cloud-based solutions for clinical research. Through our advanced applications and intelligent data analytics, Medidata helps advance the scientific goals of life sciences customers worldwide, including over 800 global pharmaceutical companies. Innovative biotech, diagnostic and device firms, leading academic medical centers, and contract research organizations. Our unparalleled clinical trial data assets provide deep insights that pave the way for future growth. The Medidata Clinical Cloud is the primary technology solution powering clinical trials for 17 of the world's top 25 global pharmaceutical companies, from study design and planning through execution, management, and reporting. Today's webinar is focused on the subject of data quality. Current methods of data quality management and monitoring are resource-intensive, and manual processes only identify risks that teams know to look for. Studies have become so complicated that it is too hard for a human to catch issues. These issues result in wasted time and money. Over the next 45 minutes today, we'll cover 4 areas. Analysis on how companies waste time and money on edit checks. The regulatory risks that result from poor data quality. What the new ICH E6 R2 guidelines mean to you. And finally, review a solution from Medidata that uses machine learning techniques to identify data errors. So let's start off today with an audience poll. So the question today is, what do you think is the best way to ensure that data is reported accurately? Please select one response. Electronic edit checks, manual monthly data review, interim and final statistical analysis, or risk-based monitoring. So we're seeing that results are coming in. We'll just give it some more time, and I'll push the results out. All right, so I will go ahead and push the results out. So I want to quickly turn it over to Stacy to see if Stacy can comment on the results of the poll here. Stacy, any comments?
Sure, Kalyani, thank you. Yeah, I think when all of you saw those options, you probably had a similar response that we did, and that is that each of the options really has a strength, and multiple strengths in each of the options have weaknesses. And I definitely agree with the majority of the audience that probably the premier way to ensure the reporting of high-quality data is through the implementation of a robust risk-based monitoring program. But even with that, if we look at traditional approaches for all of the options that we have here, even with electronic edit checks, they all rely on us to be able to sit down at the beginning of the trial to identify all of those risks early on, all of the things you think might go wrong with the data, and then try to determine ways that you can program around it and work around it through edit checks, through data reviews, through your interim analyses, and also through really robust risk-based monitoring plans. So I'd agree that RBM is probably the best approach of all of these, but traditional approaches, even around RBM, are going to fall short without leveraging something more advanced that we'll talk about in this webinar.
That's great. Thank you, Stacy. I'm going to close out the poll and return to the presentation. So companies are spending a lot of time on data quality, but with very little return on their investment. I'm going to turn to our Medidata professional services experts to understand what kinds of issues they've seen in their work. Kyle, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Kalyani. So I think also interesting in those results that we saw that risk-based monitoring was the largest. And I think one of the reasons that rings true for me is that when we think about risk-based monitoring, it is really a cross-functional activity. And so the best way to ensure data and quality and reduced risks is to work together across a clinical trial organization. And I think that's probably also one of the biggest challenges why, if we look at the historical models, sponsors and CROs have ultimately struggled to really get a full return on their investments. And if we think about the way many trials have worked in the past, we've had all of these different functions working in very specific silos with their functional area plans. So we've always talked about site monitors who in the past have done 100% SDV and SDR. So they're checking every data point in the field before it even gets submitted or shortly thereafter. In data management, we've seen a heavy reliance on edit checks, custom functions, and a series of other reporting tools that allow data managers to really look at the data and to look for additional data anomalies. And then when we think about medical and safety reviews, they're often looking at patient profiles or listings for select patients that have met certain criterion from a clinical relevance perspective. And I think each of those, in their own respect, we're also looking at the same data in different ways. And in doing so, we're kind of looking at the data multiple times. So we had a lot of duplication in looking at the data across time. In addition to that, I think many of these processes historically have been inefficient in the fact that they haven't leveraged data assets or some of the more advanced data analytic solutions that other industries outside of the pharmaceutical industry have definitely been leveraging over the same time period. And so as we look to the future, the need to access the same clinical trial data, so all of these different groups, monitoring, data managers, medical and safety, they're all looking at the same data, which is our clinical trial data. And as we move into the future and we start to see additional data sources coming directly from patients or through e-source type of solutions, that data is going to actually get larger. The pool of data is going to get significantly larger, especially with mHealth and getting direct data from patients on a daily basis. And so when we think about how do we start to build the right structure to really drive towards a return on investment, it comes down to a couple things that we've been focused on. The first is setting up an integrated quality risk management plan within your organization or with your partners. And in doing so, in an integrated quality risk management plan, it's breaking down the silos of what each function is doing together and forcing them to collaborate and define their risks, and then to define who is responsible for evaluating the different types of risks for your critical data and your critical processes. And so you can really get a line of sight across your organization and who's touching the data and in what ways, and that's important. The second piece we've been really focused on is enabling those groups to work within one platform in a cross-functional collaborative space. So having everyone looking at the same data through their own individual functional workspaces, but with built-in workflow that allows all of those groups to communicate and collaborate as issues or data quality concerns are raised during a study. And so to mobilize in those directions, and I think both of those are really fundamental, as we'll talk about within the new ICH guidance, there's definitely going to be some upfront investment that companies have to invest to achieve that longer-term ROI. But what we've seen with customers is the sort of ROIs that they're expecting once they implement all of this cross-functional way of working is going to be significant as we move forward. So thanks.
Got it. That's great. Thanks, Kyle. Stacy, what's been your experience?
Sure, and I completely agree with what Kyle is saying about these multidisciplinary teams that we're all working on, and the importance of ensuring that those teams are truly looking with a unified approach. You know, that's going to be incredibly critical, especially with the complexity of trials. I think that's something I want to make sure we continue hitting on, is that, you know, you all the audience members as well as the folks on the phone, we've seen the trial designs just really mature to a standpoint that they're at a point now that it's quite difficult for one human being or even a team of people to be able to anticipate everything that might go wrong in the trial. So it's absolutely critical, as Kyle pointed out, to have these multiple disciplinary teams working together, planning together, overseeing the data together, and then additionally leveraging some of this technology that we're seeing develop, leveraging machine learning to be able to put the right technologies in the hands of this very capable team to give them the insights and the data that we've been missing. You know, one of the many things that has become very difficult to be able to do is to leverage the data from an individual patient population, so an individual trial, to understand what normal is like for that trial. We haven't been able to do that in the past, and we're now to a point that we are able to begin leveraging that clinical trial data to understand what normal looks like. Because we all know, you know, that one group of patients, one patient population, behaves differently than another. You may be using sites where patients are more sick than the general population and you haven't anticipated. You need to know that as you're starting to implement your RBM strategy and as you're working throughout the trial, so that you can then adapt your approach as the trial goes on and as you learn more and more about the patients on that specific trial. So it's quite an exciting time that we're able to begin to do this.
Got it. That's very interesting. So I want to turn to Ruthie for a bit here. So Ruthie, prior to Medidata, you were at the FDA for 22 years. Could you provide your perspective on regulatory submission risks that arise from poor data quality?
Yes, thank you. I'd love to do that. And honestly, I've seen a range of possible outcomes based on data quality. The most common, and of course the one that everyone is aiming for, is that the FDA finds the data quality at least acceptable, and data quality issues do not impact the review of the marketing application. However, in the cases where data quality is questioned, the agency often requests additional efficacy or safety sensitivity analyses that exclude problematic patients or sites, and the consistency between those analyses and the overall original analyses will be important. Often, though, the lack of power associated with the reduction in the sample size is very problematic. But even if the consistency is achieved, the data quality issues can be costly in that they compromise the reviewer's opinion of the application and just invite additional scrutiny of the application in other areas. In rare cases, the identification of a small number of severely compromised sites could bring the entire study into question. I have seen cases where the agency concludes that problems uncovered at certain sites are likely to be systemic, and so that the entire study is suspect and not reliable. Very serious data quality issues can sometimes disqualify an application from presentation at advisory committee meeting, and the rationale there is that the experts on the committee should not be expected or could not be expected to resolve data quality issues, and they should not be asked to opine on data that is faulty. And then in the most severe cases, the agency may reject the study, request confirmation of efficacy and safety with an additional trial, or simply not approve the product. So there's some very serious outcomes with problematic data quality. And then on the next slide, what I'm showing you is one example of how FDA handled an important phase 4 study with data quality issues. This example was made public by an advisory committee that was held last fall. The study in question here was a large phase 4 safety study required by FDA as a post-marketing commitment to examine the occurrence of neuropsychiatric events with the use of the product. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the setup of an advisory committee, but it's essentially a day-long meeting focused on the single application, and the day ends with a vote about the critical aspects of the discussion. So after this day-long discussion, much of it which was centered on data quality issues, the question posed to the committee of experts by the FDA about data quality, the committee had these responses. They commented on the possible underreporting of adverse events, and they had heightened concern because of the unexpectedly low adverse event rate in the placebo group. Some commented that excluding problematic sites from the analysis doesn't get at the fundamental issue of underreporting adverse events. And in addition, many of the members of the committee suggested that their faith in the study had been compromised, and I think we can't underestimate the impact of something like that. And so just noting, while most of the analyses of the observed data were largely positive and indicated that the product did not increase the risk of neuropsychiatric events, the advisory committee vote was split with 10 in favor and 9 against removal of the black box warning for this product. And the rationale for the negative votes was very often concerns around data quality and what conclusions might have been reached if complete and accurate data were available. So this is one example where data quality concerns played a very important role in the regulatory outcome of the submission.
Got it. So it's time for another poll. Would love to hear from all of you. Just launch the poll here real quick. So the question here is, what of the following do you find most difficult to identify early in the study? Please select up to 2 responses. Your options are missing lab samples, fraudulent reporting of data, for example, patients with exactly the same blood pressure at every visit, inconsistencies across 2 related data variables, for example, height and weight, over or under reporting of adverse events, and your last option is protocol compliance issues. All right, I see responses coming in. We'll give it just about 30 more seconds here. All right. So I'm about to close the poll. Push the results out. All right, excellent. So it's interesting that identifying these types of risks early in a trial is critical and also a core component of some of your risk-based monitoring strategies. Let's now take a closer look at risk-based monitoring and how it's impacted by the recent ICH E6 addendum. Kyle, could you please walk us through that?
Certainly, and I think it's really interesting to hear Ruthie's experience, obviously, from working at the FDA. I think when we think about risk-based monitoring or managing risks in our clinical trials, of course, this has gone back for many years. I think the tipping point which caused the regulatory agencies to put out their guidance now almost 6 years ago was, I think, exactly the experience that these regulatory agencies had when data was submitted with all of these traditional ways of looking at data that didn't use some of the more advanced ways of looking at data. There still was a substantial amount of data discrepancies or errors at the end of the day when data was submitted. And I think not only the industry but the regulatory agencies continue to scratch their heads. And with all this data now that was starting to be accumulated through EDC and other solutions, the fact that the data was still being submitted with these types of errors really struck a chord, which was we're missing something. We're not doing something effectively in the current model. And so they've really been pushing towards a model that is more data-centric, more risk-focused, because by focusing on those things, of course, the ultimate philosophy here is we're going to really ensure that the data that they're most interested in looking at is also of the highest quality when they're looking at it. And a lot of the data cleaning we talked about earlier, all these different sources, was at the end of the day very rudimentary and not really looking for some of the larger pattern detection. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think as this has evolved now over the last few years, the industry has weighed in with Transcelerate. But more importantly is now the new ICH addendum that is being released. Officially, it was the final guidance was issued in November of 2016. It is now going through a ratification of that within Europe, and what we understand is that it's expected to go into more of an enforcement phase later in 2017, sometime in the Q3 time frame. So next slide. So as I mentioned, part of this has really been around how are we leveraging data more effectively. And the ICH has been really, I think, upfront in talking about the different methodologies that it sees that should be part of the process. The ICH does not, of course, specify one methodology over another, but it looks at all of these as part of the ways that pharmaceutical companies and CROs should be interrogating their data. I think probably most relevant when we think about where the change has occurred is letter C here, which is using statistical analyses to identify data trends and consistency and pattern detection. Historically, a lot of these statistical analyses were done after database lock, which is, of course, way too late to actually impact and improve quality during the study conduct. And so really focusing on using statistical methodologies, identifying not just what is a risk indicator based on some predefined threshold, but really looking for statistical ways of identifying the true areas or risks, and then really focusing your remediation activities on those has really been an important part of where the guidance has developed from and where companies are now working to obviously meet these new requirements that have been positioned by the ICH.
Excellent, Kyle. Thank you for walking us through that. I'd like to ask the audience here to get a sense of what progress you're making on complying with these new regulations. So if you don't mind answering this other question for us about your progress in the process of implementing changes to comply with the ICH E6R2. If you could just select one response. You haven't started, you are implementing new technology, you're deep in discussions about arguing about what it means, or that you're done implementing these changes. So the question again is, where are you in the process of implementing changes to comply with ICH E6R2? Okay, I believe we have some technical difficulties around this one question, so I'm just going to skip it at this point, and we'll continue on with our presentation. Well, let's see if this poll works. So the final poll here today is, what is your biggest challenge in implementing ICH E6R2? Please select all that apply. Your options are internal resistance, organizational alignment, availability of knowledge experts, lack of technologies, or knowing where to start. All right, this poll has started to see some responses come in. We'll give it about 30 more seconds, and we'll close the poll here. All right, 5 more seconds and I'll close the poll. All right. So here are the results of the poll. So Kyle, turning it over to you, in your experience working with sponsors and sites, how do some of these responses, and I'm going to open up the options here.
So thanks, Kalyani. I know that we had the first polling question that went through, but what I imagine we would have seen is that most companies have started their implementation plans and processes, but I think it's also probably safe to say that no one probably feels that they're really fully done with implementing a true holistic risk-based monitoring solution. There's a lot of great models that are out there that are starting to surface, but scaling them and getting them across an entire pipeline is something that still will probably be ongoing for the next couple of years. I am very happy as far as this poll to look at and to see that the first point here, internal resistance, is low. That's actually great to see. I think one of the struggles in getting to this point with adoption has been different points of resistance. I think, though, when we look at the breakdown of the other ones, not also surprised to see that there's a couple different areas that are really a focus for companies as they're looking at implementing and really fully adopting an RBM approach. I think the first one, I mean, we think about what's been happening in the industry over the last couple of years is that there's been a lot of high-level guidance that has been out and available. Certainly the Transcelerate and all the regulatory guidance papers that have been out help to really frame a very sort of high-level overview of what the strategies should look like. But really trying to develop a operational solution with all of the details needed to really understand roles and responsibilities, what are the technologies, and what are the processes. I mean, the people, process, technologies all have a critical role in ensuring that you have a complete strategy built out. The change management element here for us, from what we've seen and experienced, is definitely substantial, and it has to be factored into your initial plans. I think if we look here, certainly around organizational alignment and availability of the knowledge experts, sort of to me strikes at the challenge of trying to get an organization to work together, and it really does need a full change management approach to bring those people and organizations together. I think one of the other things we've seen is there has been a lot of noise in the industry. A lot of different ideas have been floating around, but from working with a lot of companies over the last year, I think the overall strategies are starting to align around a couple core concepts. How that manifests for us when we're working with companies, we like to take a stepwise approach. So I think I've talked about this earlier in the webinar, but one of the first places we start with is just helping companies establish a risk assessment process and developing a fully integrated quality risk management plan that brings all these functional silos together under one plan and defines all their roles and responsibilities. That's been really important to achieve the organizational alignment here that you can see has definitely been one of the areas that companies have struggled with. And it forces departments to really understand what's critical and to divide up those monitoring responsibilities, leveraging their data and their analytics to ultimately drive towards that. And so that's really, I think, an important area that we focused on. And as I mentioned also, creating a collaborative space during the execution phase of a study so these roles can work together. So in addition to change management and overall organizational alignment, I think one of the other big areas that we caution companies is to not underestimate the time required for change in that change management approach. Training is fundamental in helping companies learn how to leverage data and analytics in a different way, how to apply more critical thinking versus tactical monitoring of data. And so as we think about all of these things happening in concert, really implementing a full plan and going all the way through that process, you'll get a chance to tackle all these challenges and come away with an ultimate solution that will really drive innovation and quality improvements across your future clinical trials.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyle. Stacy, I want to turn to you now to talk about the solution that Medidata has, which uses a novel approach to help the industry comply with ICH E6R2. Could you tell us about that solution?
Sure. On that next slide, Kalyani, yeah. As Kyle talked about in the poll, one of the pieces that people are struggling with is identifying the right technology, right? And you can also remember he spoke about one of the ICH new requirements to use statistical analysis or analytic approach to the identification of data trends within and across sites. And that's something that is really core to the central piece around centralized statistical analytics. As we've mentioned a couple of times, it's a technology based on machine learning. And it leverages machine learning to take in all of the data in the trial. And that data in the trial is, the CSA is source agnostic. So you can bring in RAVE, EDC, electronic data capture data. You can bring in other forms of EDC. We also integrate and bring in the laboratory data, ECG data, a lot of types of eDiary data, ePro, and other patient patient-centric sources. We bring those sources into CSA and integrate them. That the advanced algorithms and the machine learning then hit against all of the data in the study, and it essentially compares every variable to every other variable in the study to learn what normal looks like for that trial. And then anything that doesn't fit within those patterns that have been created on the study gets flagged as a potential anomaly to be investigated. And you can see here a graphic of one of the visualizations that's common in CSA, where on the y-axis you see the study day of resection, and this is a solid tumor oncology study. So the study day of removing that tumor. And then on the x-axis, you see the study day of diagnosis. Those 2 points that you see the arrows beside, those are examples in which CSA is flagging that there are 2 outliers there in which patients are being diagnosed before their tumor is being resected, which is not possible, right? You have to have the solid tumor removed and tested before you can make a diagnosis on it. And so this is an example where CSA clearly sees a relationship between study day of resection, study day of diagnosis, without you as the end user having to tell it to look for it. And it sees a problem with a couple of patients where they're being diagnosed in a manner that's just not logical or accurate. A lot of times what we're seeing in this situation is that electronic edit checks have already been built around these and fired appropriately at the site. But the sites are becoming so inundated with edit checks that many times they're responding in these cases to say that the source data is correct. And then the CRAs, the data managers, are also inundated with the responses. And so we're seeing them just blindly accept those responses, closing out the queries, and then these data errors are remaining in the system. Again, these are examples that regulatory agencies would probably look at if they saw a pattern in this. So as you see on the left-hand side, as I said earlier, CSA is source agnostic, so you can bring in multiple sources into the system. It detects and looks for patterns, and then we're also building in that critical workflow management that Kyle mentioned earlier to ensure that our cross-functional teams are able to work together in a robust manner within the system. So it's been used across large and small pharma. It's been used in some of our partner CROs, and so this is something that we see is going to really start advancing our industry the way it has other industries. And if we think about that on the next slide with a look at a business case for it. So once you've got a technology that can make a difference, we as end users and companies, we've got to really vet them very critically to ensure that they're going to make good business sense as we bring them in. So will they financially have the return on the investment that gets made in the beginning? So what our teams have done is we've been working with multiple clients to be able to look at how they're currently doing their work and how effective it's been. And if you look at the top here, you can see an example in which we did an analysis of the manual data reviews being done. So that's your use of SAS reports and SAS Jump and Spotfire, JReview, sometimes custom CTMS reports. So those manual reviews you do throughout the life of the study, sometimes monthly. We took a look at those, and we've done many of these studies now where we've gone line by line by line to see what reviews that CSA would do in an automated fashion, and the end user no longer have to set up those reports and review the reports on a regular basis. And we've been struck that this example here you see on this study is reflective of many others that we've done, in which we've seen that on this study, it was a large phase 3, again, an oncology study, in which you see the number of monthly data reviews throughout the life of the study, how long each one was taking. This was based on the input of the lead data manager on the trial. And then you can see the savings. And what this shows you is that about half of the manual reviews done on this trial could be completely automated with the use of CSA and its advanced algorithms. And then down below, if you look at the next graphic, what that's showing you is we did a very similar analysis for edit checks, but in which we looked across trials for an individual sponsor. And for all of the trials that we looked at for that sponsor, 74% of the edit checks that were ever created had never one time Again, we've done this analysis a ton of time with different clients, and we're seeing very similar things. Sometimes we're seeing upwards of 94% of edit checks never firing. But what this is painting is a really clear business case to show us that the traditional approaches we've been taking, while they have helped us improve the data quality through the years, they're not as effective as they could be. And therefore, leveraging and implementing a system like CSA within the context of a robust risk-based monitoring program makes good business sense as well as clinical trial data sense. So in the end, we're able to identify the risks faster. We're able to compare sites objectively and take a step back and see site-to-site performance issues. And we can collaborate across functions on the risks that are seen so that we can then ensure the best quality in the data and even in a more cost-effective approach than we've done in the past. And then if we transition to the next slide, we're also, in addition to being able to now leverage a much more advanced technology and a technology that makes good productivity sense to implement, we're now starting to fundamentally change the way we're looking at the data on the trial. We're starting to see the convergence of these workspaces or these functional areas that have traditionally been very siloed. So in the past, data management, central monitoring, medical monitoring have all had usually different technologies, different workflows, different communication channels. And as Kyle pointed out earlier, it's resulted in us all replicating a lot of the work, but also not having a full holistic view of the patient and of the site. Now, if we compare that to the way medical practices have advanced, we know that patient care now is done in a much better team approach. You know, if we stay on the theme of oncology, if you've got a cancer patient, typically they're seeing an oncologist, but they're also seeing an oncology surgeon, they're seeing an infusion nurse, they're seeing a nutritionist, they're seeing a psychologist, they're seeing multiple experts that are all working together as a team for that patient. Now we're starting to see an emerging technology that's going to allow the same kind of care and oversight of clinical trial data in a team approach, leveraging the same technology, the same workflow, the same communication plan channels to ensure the highest quality of data and the best oversight for those patients. So it's a really incredibly powerful time for the industry and, you know, a change we've been seeing in other industries, and we're glad to bring it here.
That's great, Stacey. Thank you so much for walking us through it. So to kind of wrap this all up and bring it together, I want to turn to Ruthie. Ruthie, could you describe for us how CSA could have addressed issues that was found by FDA in the example that you talked about earlier?
Yes, so on the next slide, as we mentioned before, the major concern from the experts at the advisory committee held last fall was the possible underreporting of adverse events. So what I'm showing you now is a real but anonymized case study illustrating how CSA can identify possible under or over reporting of adverse events. In this case, CSA identified that sites in Italy, which made up more than 10% of the study population, were significantly underreporting adverse events. On the next slide, we can see some more details. On the left of the slide, we see a display of the sites ordered by their adverse event rate per patient year. And we can see that there are 3 sites at the top identified with possible underreporting of adverse events. From the display at the top of the slide, also from CSA, we see that these sites reported no headaches, and that's represented with the red square. This is unusual in that headache was the most commonly reported adverse event in the overall study at a rate of nearly 20%, which is represented by the green triangle. And then the display on the bottom of the slide illustrates the identification of several patients with very low hemoglobin relative to other patients in the study, and yet no anemia event was reported for these patients. And most of those patients were enrolled at the 3 Italian sites of concern. So in this way, CSA provides a comprehensive look at the rate and type of adverse events being reported by each site to allow identification of differential results and correction and retraining of sites as needed so that the errors and criticisms of the study results based on data quality, such as were discussed at last fall's advisory committee, are avoided.
Excellent. Thank you, Ruthie. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you, Kyle, Stacy, and Ruthie, for your perspectives. We'd now like to answer some of the questions that have come in throughout the session here. So, Ruthie, I believe this is for you. The question is, what factors are used by the FDA to motivate site selection for audit?
So there's a number of things that are considered. One that most in the industry are aware of is simply the size of the site. Often the FDA will audit the largest or one of the largest sites in the study. But there are other factors as well. If FDA perceives that a single site is driving the efficacy or safety result for the study, they're likely to audit that site. Or if the clinical or statistical reviewers have a suspicion that the data seem either way too good, sort of unbelievably good, or if they've already uncovered some problematic inconsistencies, that can motivate the choice of that site to be audited.
Interesting. Kyle, here's a question for you. What are the most important elements to consider when implementing a technology designed to drive compliance with the new ICH E6 guidelines?
Yeah, so I think there's really three areas that we're really focusing on, and working with customers today. What we've seen is that there are a number of different elements in use to deliver their cross-functional RBM strategy. When we think about regulatory compliance, we really are focused on sort of an end-to-end solution and platform. So something that, if you look at the Transcelerate guidance from December of last year, when they issued their guidance around the technology infrastructure, this goes back actually to December 2015, what the industry is really looking for is a complete solution, a platform basically for risk-based monitoring. And that's going to create this end-to-end traceable matrix, which will allow you to define your risks, build in your key risk indicators or your analytics, assign different roles and responsibilities to different functions in order to review their data and analytics and to take action on them, and then to manage any observed risks through a series of workflow and issue management that's all system bound, meaning that there should be no spreadsheets, should be no elements outside of the systems, because if you do that, once you do that, you're kind of outside of a truly compliant way of working, at least that you can show in evidence to the regulatory authorities. So having this complete closed-loop system, which has end-to-end risk management, is really what we're focused on in helping customers deploy a complete solution.
Got it. Thank you. Stacy, this one seems like this one's for you. So the question is, I can see the apparent merit of machine learning, but how are other sponsors implementing it in the midst of already using Spotfire and SAS for a lot of this?
Sure, and earlier you heard some great overview about some of the implementation plans that clients are using, including change management, and other aspects that were shared. In addition to that, one of the core pieces gets at the heart of this question is that it's really important to go through and assess how the use of CSA is going to change how you're currently using other technologies like Spotfire that's listed here. And the way we're seeing and we're working with clients to do this is actually to go through a couple of their active studies and work through the individual data reviews that are being done and how they're being done. So similar to that analysis that I showed you earlier where we went line by line on current manual data reviews, as we're doing that, we're making suggestions of which of those reviews should be done in CSA. At the end of the day, what you're left with is a great sample to show you the percentage that could be done in an automated fashion in CSA, like I showed you the 50%, but then also which ones could be done with very little intervention, but still some manual intervention in CSA. And when you add those two together, a lot of times you get closer to the 75% or more. And that's when you're able to take those remaining reviews in Spotfire, in SAS, and other applications and look to see what you're left. In many cases, what we're left with is the ability to consolidate down in the list that you have left down to one other technology. And the hope would be that over time to then leverage CSA. In addition to that, something that's been important for clients when implementing the system for the first time is to actually start looking at the types of issues that are being found. Because as we've shared with you, it's fundamentally changing the way you're looking at data. And in reference to what we're talking about here is what that's doing is it's actually surfacing issues that you never knew were there. So that underreporting of adverse event example that Ruthie showed you, we're seeing that on almost every trial we look at because CSA surfaces the information to you in a simpler way. Also, we're seeing issues between different case report forms. We're seeing relationship issues between the e-diary data and the results that the site is reporting for the same type of assessment. And so CSA starts to give you insights and give you visibility into those issues that you never knew were there. So we're seeing that it's really important for clients to actually observe that type of issue on CSA so that we can then incorporate it into their practice of implementing it because it is a fundamentally different way of looking at things.
Very interesting. So the next question, Stacy or Kyle, this could either of you could answer this question. So the question is, CSA gives the complete risk-based monitoring data. However, what could be the additional steps to ensure the inconsistencies are corrected? How could we reduce the chances of site do similar to edit checks which get closed as correct as source document?
Stacy, did you want to go
I'm
first?
looking at this. Sure. And Kalyani, I may need you to read that again because the visual that I'm seeing doesn't have the complete question. So do you mind reading it one more time?
Sure. CSA gives the complete risk-based monitoring data. However, what could be the additional steps to ensure the inconsistencies are corrected? How could we reduce the chances of site do similar to edit checks which get closed as correct as source document?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's a terrific question because one of the great merits of CSA is that it will allow you, as you see one of these issues, remember back to that visual that I showed you with the outlier that had it pointed out. As you see that visual, you can go to the site and query the site to get a response, get a correction to the data. If the site does respond correct as per source doc, the data manager closes that query out and the issue still remains in the system. The next time you run CSA, that's still going to be there as an outlier for you to see. And so you can see in that example, it's clearly wrong. It's clearly illogical. That would then equip you to be able to most likely tag that one for a monitoring visit and have the monitor actually go out to the site. And even if the source documents are out there saying what that data says, it's not humanly possible to be correct. So you're then equipping the monitor in a different way than they've had before to be able to go out to the site and get the data corrected and fixed and still have visibility into the system as to the status of it. So it just gives you much better visibility, whereas with an edit check, once it fires and you closed it out, it's no longer there anymore. So it doesn't flag you, where the issue in CSA is still staring at you.
And Kalyani, one of the other elements that we have within CSA is the ability to develop key risk indicators that are tracking your known risks and leveraging data in some statistical methodologies. How we look to manage that, because some of these risks that are patterns at certain sites require a series of follow-ups and actions to ultimately identify the root cause and then apply different corrective actions. So with a KRI trending plot, we look at how centralized monitors and field monitors can track certain risk indicators over time and continue to apply additional remediation activities until obviously the KRI returns into a normal level. So that's one of those things that's not a specific data point correction, but more of a risk and a site pattern, which doesn't always have as quick of a resolution, but does having a way of tracking it and looking to resolve it over time is an important part of the solution.
Got it. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. So the next question here, Ruthie, this is probably for you. Does FDA focus on certain parts of the data more than the others, or are all data thoroughly reviewed?
Well, I think that the FDA does focus on key pieces of information. They're under a limited review time when they're looking at applications. So they're probably first looking at efficacy results, and probably the primary and key secondary or major secondary endpoints are of great interest to them. So if there are any problems with those variables, that would lead to further investigation of the data quality elsewhere in the study. And then also another key aspect that would be examined during the early part of the filing of the review would be any inconsistencies in the safety data. So lab values that should correspond to an adverse event being reported and an adverse event is not reported, or just an overabundance or underabundance of adverse events. So there are key pieces of information that are looked at first, and probably in time for the filing of the application. And then data quality is considered throughout the cycle, and it's sort of on a case-by-case basis how deep that investigation goes. Sometimes it can go to far-reaching parts of the data set, and sometimes not.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So here's one last question as we get close to the bottom of the hour here. This is about machine learning, so Stacy, this is probably for you. The question is, we've piloted another product that touts the use of machine learning, but all it did was surface too much noise. We had so many issues we didn't know how to manage them. How is this different?
Sure, and within CSA we use a few methodologies to be able to ensure that we decrease the amount of noise that's being surfaced to the end user, and I'll just highlight a couple of those. The first thing that we do is that as we are surfacing issues, one of the elements that we consider is prioritization. So we have a prioritization weighting in which adverse events, for example, are weighted to be more important than demographics. So that kind of weighting helps us to ensure that we're surfacing the right kind of issues at the top. The other thing that we do within CSA is we do something called clustering, and that's where we look for patients that just naturally look a little similar to each other in their attributes. And as we create these clusters, you can actually drill down in to see what's similar between those patients. Why are they behaving the same? Or in a cluster or relationship. And then within each cluster, that is used, only issues that are within the cluster are actually surfaced to you. And the reason that we do that is to ensure that we're not just identifying every potential relationship in the entire study and surfacing things that are relationships by chance. We make sure that those issues that are relationships also fit within these clusters, and that does a dramatic improvement in the amount of noise that's surfaced to the end user. So once you look at the clustering, and then we also apply the prioritization, we have a few other methodologies we use, but we'll probably save those for a different day because they're much more technical. But we use this all in the effort to make sure that we're surfacing true issues to the end users and not just a lot of noise.
And Kalyani, I would just add one thing, which is a lot of the guidance we give to customers really goes back to their risk assessment and categorization processes. Through that, they're defining critical data and critical study procedures, and as we know, and Stacey just said, they're not all considered equal. So having an approach to look at your analytics which is really focused on the areas of risk that are most important and could have the most impact to your study is definitely a way to focus your resources and really target what they're looking for.
Got it. Thank you, Kyle and Stacy. I really appreciate all of your insights and advice. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And I now want to turn it over to Jennifer at Fierce to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you, everyone. We had a lot of great questions today and couldn't get to them all, but we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. Thank you for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers especially for participating and Medidata for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page you used to register for this event. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.